Good morning. My name's John Bennett. I'm Executive Director, Sierra Club Canada. I'm joined this morning by Dr. Oel Hendrickson from the Concerned Citizens of Renfrew and by Dr. Gordon Edwards of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. We're here today to talk about tritium and about the potential of relicensing a company called Shield Source in Peterborough, Ontario, to give it a 10-year license to continue releasing tritium into the environment in the Peterborough region, but also to produce products that actually end up in the environment as well. Tritium is a waste product from Canada's CANDU reactors. It's radioactive hydrogen, and it's not good for us. It creates cancer and other problems. Around the world, tritium has been recognized as a serious threat to human health, except in Canada, where the limits allowed in Canadian drinking water are far higher than anywhere else in the OECD countries. We would like the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission to actually do its job and protect Canadian public health rather than protect the Canadian nuclear industry. The only reason this company exists is to find a reason or an excuse to use tritium to try and extract a few more dollars out of the nuclear industry, and as a public relations act by the industry to say, look at all the useful products. But tritium is not an isotope that's used in medical treatment. It's an isotope that actually hurts people. So I'm going to hand it over first to Dr. Edwards, and then to Oel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's very important to realize that not only do we have a regulatory agency here in Canada, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which is dysfunctional in the sense that it never really sends anybody. It's like the coach of the nuclear industry. It never sends anybody to the penalty box. It never suspends anybody. It never fines anybody. It just gives them a pep talk. And in essence, it gives a license to industry to continue to pollute. And this is what is wrong with the Shield Source operation in Peterborough. What we have here, as mentioned earlier, is a dangerous, hazardous radioactive material for which the Ontario Power Generation built a special facility called the Tritium Removal Facility to remove tritium, which is an unwanted radioactive byproduct of CANDU reactors. Why? In order to protect the workers from unnecessary exposures, which is a hazard to them, and in order to protect the environment by removing the tritium before it gets out into Lake Ontario, where the levels are double what they are in Lake Superior, thanks to tritium releases from CANDU reactors. So the tritium removal facility was a way of trying to mitigate, to try and reduce the health and environmental impacts. Now that same tritium is being sold and transported to Peterborough, where it is going up the stack, ending up in the soil, ending up in the air, ending up in the water of this local community. It is a sloppy operation. It's a sloppy operation because they cannot keep this stuff contained. They give it off regularly into the environment. A couple of years ago, they had a spill which in a few minutes gave off more tritium up the stacks than are released in an entire year by some of our nuclear reactors in Canada. So we feel that this industry should not be getting a license at all. In fact, they should not be operating in a public place such as the Peterborough Airport, which is where they're located. They should be, perhaps, right where the tritium facility is, right where the tritium removal facility is. They should be treating this stuff as a dangerous waste product and not exposing people unnecessarily to it. Now, one of the problems with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission in dealing with this problem is that for years they have been using bad science. In fact, it's even anti-science in order to counteract what is already known. It has been known for years, in fact for decades, that tritium is at least 2 or 3 times more hazardous than what the calculations of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission uses, and yet they refuse to change their standards. 2 independent scientific committees appointed by the Ontario government have looked at the tritium and standards for tritium in drinking water, and they have both said that the existing tritium standards are at least 350 times too lax. They should be tightened by at least 350 times. And yet, our Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is fighting those changes. They don't want the standards to be tightened. So what we have here is a rogue agency, an agency which is charged by law to protect the public health and safety, an agency which says on their website they will never compromise safety, an agency which claims to support what's called the ALARA principle, which is keeping exposures as low as reasonably achievable, but which in fact bends every effort in the opposite direction to try and prevent tightening of the standards, to prevent proper estimation of the hazard of this material, and to expose people unnecessarily in an ongoing fashion to this dangerous material. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Ole Hendrickson with Concerned Citizens of Renfrew County. In Pembroke, Ontario, we also have a tritium light facility and a history of accidental releases, very high-level releases. And so we're also concerned about what's going on in Peterborough. It's a very similar operation of filling glass tubes with this radioactive waste product from CANDU reactors and sealing them in a glow-in-the-dark type tube with a phosphor coating. Just a few facts on tritium. It takes about 2.5 milligrams of tritium to make a tritium exit sign. You've seen those, I'm sure. 1,000 times more, 2.5 grams of tritium are roughly what's needed for a nuclear weapon. Tritium enhances the yield of nuclear weapons. 2.5 kilograms of tritium is roughly what's produced in all of CANDU reactors in any one given year. And that's very similar to the natural production of tritium. Roughly 2.5 to 3 kilograms of tritium are produced through cosmic radiation. The action of the solar radiation with the upper atmosphere forms a small amount of tritium. So our CANDU reactors produce annually about as much as is produced naturally. When Shield Source Incorporated, SSI, applied to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission in 2009 for a renewal of its operating license, I made an intervention at that time, noting that the CNSC had set the release limit for tritium gas, this radioactive gas from Shield Source Incorporated, at 34 million trillion becquerels per year. Now, the total amount produced by all the CANDU reactors in Ontario is roughly annually around 1 million trillion. So, and they'd set the limit at 34 times the amount produced annually in CANDU reactors, which is even more actually than is stored probably in the Darlington Tritium Recovery Facility that Gordon referred to. So how did they come up with this absurd limit, which is way 10 times the total amount of tritium, way higher than what's in the atmosphere, what's produced naturally? And every year, if Shield Source had wanted to, they could have emitted way more than the total amount of tritium in the world if they could have found a source of it. But of course, there wasn't even any place in the world to get that much tritium. There would have been a global health crisis. There would have been an outcry from around the world that this is a horrible thing. Why did the CNSC do that? And why, when I made that sort of impassioned intervention 2.5 or 3 years ago when they got their license, why didn't they just reduce the amount, the emissions limit? Well, we found out why it's handy for CNSC to have such a ridiculous emissions limit in February of 2010, when this accident happened in Peterborough, when SSI released 150 trillion becquerels of tritium gas into the environment. And they chose to say, well, that's trivial because we can release 34 million trillion becquerels of this substance in a year. So, and they put that, the CNSC staff actually said in a midterm hearing on SSI that, and I'll quote, on February 1st, 2010, SSI released 147.25 terabecquerels, that's trillion becquerels of tritium gas, into the environment due to an accidental release from the tritium fill machine, which exceeded SSI's weekly action level of 17 trillion becquerels, but is far below the license release limits of 34 million trillion becquerels per year. So even though I pointed out that that's ridiculous, they kept that limit, that derived release limit, in SSI's license. And it was so why but interestingly, there's a second release limit, a legal release limit in SSI's license, which is only 500 trillion becquerels. Still way higher than we think is safe, but way below the 34 million. So in that 5-minute incident, and CNSC hasn't released details of that incident, SSI released 30% of what it's allowed to, of its legal yearly limit. 30%, not the 0.001% that they were claiming, the CNSC staff. So why have two limits? Well, the answer is simple. These derived release limits that CNSC puts in the license are very useful for communications purposes. When there's an accident or accidental release, they can compare to the derived release limits. These derived release limits are something totally unique to Canada. No other country has them. They're just there for communication purposes. Are they going to continue having these extremely high and absurd limits? Yes. They've drafted already the new license for SSI. And in that license, it still includes derived release limits of 34 million trillion becquerels of tritium per year.
Any questions?
First of all, I'm just trying to clarify a couple of issues. Are you concerned more with what you call sort of the sloppy behavior at SSI, or with the fact that they're allowed to produce their products with the product in the first place?
What they're doing here is they're taking a waste radioactive byproduct of CANDU reactors. If they could handle that properly without spilling it into the environment, then I guess that's their business, and they could be licensed to do that. But for the CNSC, whose sole purpose is to protect the health and the environment, for them to allow this plant to continue to operate when they've proven that they cannot contain this material, they give off regularly large amounts every single year. This one accident just happens to be a particularly dramatic occasion. But at the base of the smokestack, at the stack, they have like 1 million becquerels per liter in the soil of tritium contamination, which will be there for at least a century, even if the plant were removed tomorrow. We had tritium in the drinking water at the Peterborough airport, which has now been corrected because they've connected to the city supply lines. But we have crab apples, which are showing levels of about 1,000 becquerels per liter in the crab apples. So we're talking here about an operation which should never be allowed to operate outside the confines of the nuclear industry. If they want to market radioactive waste, let them do it at the nuclear sites where the reactors are, where the tritium removal plant is. Why come to an airport, a community, and unnecessarily expose all kinds of people to this radioactive insult? The fact of the matter is that, as with asbestos, as with other carcinogenic substances, cancer-causing substances, there is no scientifically determined safe level. And what's more, tritium happens to come out in the form of hydrogen, which is one of the basic building blocks of organic molecules. And we know that tritium, in fact, enters into all living things very easily once it gets out into the environment. And in case of a pregnant woman, it crosses the placenta into the fetus. This is all known. So we're exposing even unborn children to an unnecessary radiation exposure. It seems that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has forgotten the fundamental goal of radiation protection as enunciated by the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation many years ago, and that is that all unnecessary exposures to radiation should be eliminated. There should be zero unnecessary exposure to radiation. If there is to be an exposure, there should be a benefit to the people who are being exposed. There's no benefit here. So we believe that they simply should pull the license, or at least give them a grace period, maybe 3-year license. They're asking for a 10-year license. They could be they're even talking about relocating to another site on the airport, in the airport area. There still would be at the airport, but on a slightly different site, we suggest that they should be relocating completely off-site. Why not relocate at Darlington, where the tritium removal facility is, and why don't they learn to try and keep this stuff from getting out into the environment?
And so just again, just to be clear on this, what are you exactly suggesting? You said it doesn't seem like you're asking for them to shut SSI down completely.
Well, I don't think that that's something that's a different issue. I think the issue here is one of protecting the public health and the environment. If they could do this, if they could demonstrate that they could do this safely. Now, as has been pointed out, we do know that when these things go abroad and when they're sold to customers, for example, Walmart in the United States declared that they have lost track of 20,000 of these exit signs, which are filled with tritium. That means that those tritium signs could be anywhere. And so we're getting radiation exposures in landfills, which is contaminating groundwater in various parts of the world. We're getting tritium exposures for example, if there was a fire involving these exit signs, if they break, then the first responders, like the firemen and so on, are going to get radiation doses, which they don't need. So we believe that this is just another example of a quirky idea which really doesn't, in the long term, make much sense. When I was a kid, we used to have little machines where you could watch your bones wriggle in your feet. They're gone because they are unnecessary radiation exposures. When I was a kid, we used to have lung X-ray machines that would drive into the parking lot of schools. They're gone because it's an unnecessary radiation exposure. They used to have radioactive heart pacemakers for people. They're gone because it's a crazy idea. And I believe that this is also a crazy idea. These lights, in fact, don't function very well because they dim with time and they can't be replenished. They can't be recharged. So we believe that this is a bad product. But our fundamental concern here is with the actual legal mandate of the CNSC. We have an agency which is truly dysfunctional, and which is not only dysfunctional, but we feel is acting against the public interest. And we feel that this is such an urgent situation that the government of Canada has got to take a look at this, especially in the wake of the Japan Fukushima disaster, where we have seen collusion between the regulatory agency and the industry. We can't allow this to continue in Canada. We've got to sort of somebody has to blow the whistle and say, hey, this agency is acting more like part of the industry than as a policeman. They're acting more like a lapdog than a watchdog.
Can I say something on this?
Sure.
And just another concern that our group had with the licensing process at the last hearing 3 years ago was the staff comment that they felt that SSI could just increase the height of its stack from which they released these radionuclides. And of course we intervened and said that doesn't help anything. You're just spreading it around further and exposing a larger population in Peterborough to this radiation. People might get smaller exposures, but you're exposing more people and the net result could be worse. So we asked that not be allowed. The CNSC staff went ahead and approved an increase in the height of the stack. They didn't do an environmental assessment. They didn't tell the commissioners that they were doing this. And now in the documentation for the hearing that's coming up on May 2nd, the CNSC staff document says, oh, well, this is industry best practice. Well, since when is it industry best practice to spread pollution further away from a facility like this?
And anything further? I would just like to say one thing about the minister's press conference, environment minister on global warming emissions. Even if Canada is on track to meet its 17% below 2005 levels target, who cares? It's straightening the chairs on the Titanic. We have to do a lot more than 17% below 2005 levels. We have to be talking about 50% reductions on a really diving curve. And what we're getting instead is playing games with it and communications. So thank you very much.
But, I mean, you don't expect any good news or not so bad news from the minister?
Well, unless he's prepared to actually put a cap on industrial emissions, he's not giving us any news whatsoever. That's the only thing that this government can do to respond to climate change, is to put a cap on industrial emissions and then ratchet it down over the next 2 decades.
Et en français?
Unfortunately, I can't do that. Can you do that?
Not too well.
Not too well. So, we apologize.
Sorry.
So thank you very
I'd
much
like to
then.
say one final
Oh,
thing. Maybe.
okay.
I'd just like to mention another example on the tritium issue. Again, we recently discovered, and in the press kit there is a press release from February. We recently discovered, much to our surprise and horror, that the CNSC was allowing the New Brunswick Power Corporation to refill this. You know, they shut down a reactor for 4 years. It's all been renovated. It's all been renewed. All brand new pieces, parts, and so on in the core of the reactor. They are putting back the old tritium-contaminated heavy water back into that reactor. Now, why is this a problem? It means that for every year thereafter, the workers are going to be getting more tritium exposure as a result of putting that contaminated water back in the reactor, and there's going to be annually more emissions into the environment. The very reason they built the tritium removal facility originally was to reduce those impacts on the workers and on the environment. The CNSC is now allowing the New Brunswick Power Corporation to totally bypass. They don't have to use fresh heavy water, clean heavy water, which is not radioactive, nor do they have to use the tritium removal facility to get the tritium out of there. They're just going to put the old dirty water back. I was recently told that when they restarted the Chalk River reactor, they did use fresh, new heavy water. They did not put the old heavy water back in with all the tritium contamination in it. But it's just another example of how the Canadian public and Canadian politicians are not being well served by this agency. We have an agency which is really in collaboration with the industry to allow the industry, to enable the industry to do what it wants to do whenever it wants to do it. And that's not good enough when it comes to tritium, which is the major radioactive release in Canada from nuclear facilities.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Canada's national radionuclide.
That's right.